We begin this hour with new details on a legal agreement between Canada and the so-called Catholic entities. We're now learning that Ottawa agreed to, quote, forever discharge these entities from fundraising $25 million for residential school survivors. A document obtained by the Canadian press shows Ottawa released the entities from compensating survivors back in 2015. The legal bill for the church was also picked up by the federal government. The residential school settlement had obligated 48 Catholic groups to
stand by about 10 seconds,
including a promise to raise $25 million for survivors. When Ottawa gave up its appeal, those funds were no longer promised. Joining me now is Percy Lazard with the Indigenous Studies program at Wilfrid Laurier University. Percy, thank you for joining us.
Why is Squeeze Percy Lazard? I want to first acknowledge that I'm an invited guest on the Dish with One Spoon, Haldeman Track, Three Fire Confederacy, Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and that I'm having this complicated and complex conversation on your homelands. First, I'd like to comment that it just feels like another colonial harm to First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Afro-Indigenous, and Black Indigenous people to have this information shared especially after the International Day of the World's Indigenous People, where it centered Indigenous transmission of knowledge and Indigenous women and femmes. That it just feels like another colonial harm and act.
I can understand, Percy, the personal feelings that you're having today. You yourself, and our viewers may not be aware, I understand that your parents are residential school survivors. Can you talk about the personal feelings of reading something like this settlement?
I think just for those who are tuning in, content warning, trigger warning, Indian residential schools, colonial harm. Yes, I am the adult child to and grandchildren to Indian residential schools, to parents, and my sibling, who is 13 months older than I am, was the last person in my family to have gone to residential school. I think this is another act of harm where Indigenous people and their intersecting identities, which includes 2SLGBTQIA folks, another act of violence, erasure, and disappearance. When we decenter lived experiences and direction from those who have been harmed, then we have acts such as this by the government. And it really has me want to look at this mythology of separation of nation and state that often Indigenous people have been accused of, that our indigeneity, our spirituality was a mythology. But again, just looking at how the Canadian nation state and organized religions are hand in hand. And it really is a continuation of broken treaties, broken promises, broken agreements set out and the long legacy of colonial harm by both entities.
Now, accountability has been a huge factor that's come up in the last several years. Where do you think this sits along accountability? Because we know this deal was in 2015, but there has been a lot unearthed since that time. Does this set anything back?
It absolutely sets things back because, again, it undermines the labor of 6,000 folks who were brave enough under the conditions of colonialism to come forward and share their experiences in the 126 years of Indian residential schools and contribute to the thousands of pages and the Truth and Reconciliation and then one of 94 calls to action. It undermines that, and it undermines the processes of the commissioners and the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Afro-Indigenous, Black Indigenous folks who were brave enough to share their story about the egregious harms they experienced in the legacy that happened here in Indian residential schools. It undermines positioning survivors, people with lived experiences, and again, forces survivors and folks like me who are impacted by multi-generational impacts of ongoing colonialism of the residential schools.
Okay, thank you very much, Percy Lazard. We understand it's a very difficult topic and a very complex topic. We thank you for your time. Not enough time to obviously go over this today, but we appreciate you talking to us this morning. That's Percy Lazard from the Indigenous Studies program at Wilfrid University. Thanks again. Now, much of Canada,
thank you, Percy,
which has a major impact on